Under the second unit, when we were introducing the unit, we saw that there are two topics that we have to discuss. Okay, accounting for labor, and under accounting for labor, we had to study the computation of labor cost management, the different methods of remuneration, and the cause and effect of labor turnover. So we have already completed with this first part, accounting for labor. Now we're moving on to the second part, or the second half of the unit, which is accounting for overheads. And under accounting for overheads, we have to deal with overhead classification. Then we have to deal with the distribution of overhead as well. Okay, so mostly when we're talking about the accounting for overheads, it is mostly just the theoretical aspects. We're not going to be dealing with a lot of problems. Mostly we're just going to be talking about the theoretical aspects pertaining to overheads in the cost. So when we're talking about overheads and the various classifications, all of these are going to be detailed under CAS 3, or the Cost Accounting Standards 3. Mostly the revised versions will give you a more detailed account of the overheads. So overheads are very important, especially in these days of rapid technological innovation, because heavy expenditure is going to be incurred on plant modernization, which cannot be directly allocated to any particular cost unit because it will be incurred as common cost to all units of production. Okay, one thing we have to remember is that there are going to be certain costs which do not affect only one department, which do not affect only one set of production. Okay, rather there are costs which affect the entire firm as a whole, and becomes quite difficult for the firms to identify where to throw that cost in. Okay, the cost that they have incurred, which area does it belong to? It becomes quite difficult. So anything that doesn't belong to a particular department is an overhead cost. So overhead expenses, especially nowadays, they represent a significant portion of the total cost, and they have become rather more important than the actual costs incurred. Okay, overhead costs are in fact seeming to be more and more important as time passes because of the rapid increase in technology and more usage of machines. And the machines also, when you purchase machines, as we've seen earlier, we are not going to use them only for one purpose. We're going to have various departments that use one machine, like for example, a printer. It won't just be only the advertising department who'll use the printer, right? Everybody will need the printer when they're going to be doing different things, when they need to print their paperwork, when they need to print the reports, right? So, because of this continuous increasing demand or increasing dependence upon machines, overhead costs have become very important. Now, overhead costs, as we've said, they cannot be traced to any particular units, but they can be apportioned and absorbed by different methods. And when we're discussing about overhead costs, we're going to be discussing about all of these. What is a cost unit, and how exactly are you going to absorb and how you're going to apportion these indirect costs which do not have a place to go. Okay, where are you going to dump these different costs? So before that, let's look into the Cost Accounting Standard 3, the revised version. So under the Cost Accounting Standard 3, this is a standard which deals basically with the principles and methods of classification and measurement, and also assignment of production or operation overheads for determination of the cost of goods produced or services provided, and also for the presentation and disclosure in cost statements. So it is very important to have a cost accounting standard which deals with overheads, because it's quite difficult for, as we've already seen, it's quite difficult for firms to ascertain where to drop which cost. Okay, so in that situation, we need a specific guideline, we need rules to tell us how to do what. So the cost accounting standard will help firms to deal with these overheads by providing them with various principles and guidelines for classification, measurement, and assignment of overheads. So this standard basically deals with principles and methods of determining the production or operation overheads. So the main objective of this standard is to bring uniformity and consistency in the principles and methods of determining the overheads with reasonable accuracy. And the standard shall apply to the cost statements which require classification, measurement, assignment, presentation, and disclosure of overheads, including those which require attestation. And the main scope of the cost accounting standard, or the areas which they cover, are it should be applied to cost statements which require classification, measurement, assignment, presentation, disclosure of your production and operation overheads, including those requiring attestation. Okay, so those are the objectives. That is the reason why we need this cost accounting standard, and those are the areas which are covered by the cost accounting standard 3. Now, as per the CAS 3, we have these few definitions, and we are going to be using these terms over and over again. So let's look a little into the meaning or into the meaning of these various terms. So under the cost accounting standard, you have firstly abnormal cost. So abnormal cost, from the name itself, a cost which is not normal, which is not regular, something that is not typical. So an unusual or an atypical cost whose occurrence is usually irregular and unexpected or due to some abnormal situation of production or operation. Okay, so from the name itself, something which arises out of abnormal situations, something that is not regular, something that is not normal occurrence, that is an abnormal cost. Second point, absorption of production or operation overheads. That is when you are assigning the overheads cost to various departments in order for them to be absorbed. Okay, for absorbing of cost means to reduce the cost by putting them in various departments. Okay, so absorption of production or operation overheads is to assign the production or operation overheads to cost objects by means of appropriate absorption rate. And the third point, administrative overheads. So administrative overheads refers to all those costs which are relating to the administrative work. So cost of all activities relating to general management and administration of an entity. Fourth point, cost center. Cost center is basically the area where the cost is incurred. So any unit of an entity is selected with a view or to accumulating all costs under that unit. The unit can be a division, department, section, group of plant and machinery, group of employees, or combination of several units. And then you have cost object. Cost object refers to an activity, a contract. It can even be a cost center, customer, process, product, project, service, or any other object for which costs are ascertained. So any material or any area for which the cost has been measured is termed as a cost object. And then you have production or operation overheads. So all of those costs incurred on producing or the costs incurred when you are carrying out the work in terms of operating, then those will be your production and operation overheads. So indirect costs involved in the production of a product or in providing service are your production or operation overheads. So now I want you to have a clear picture of the classification of each cost. Okay, so you've already seen under the first unit when you are seeing all these prime costs and so on, right? When you were preparing the cost sheet, you would have calculated total cost and you would have seen the classification when you had prime costs and then you had your overheads or your additional costs. Okay, so in case of the total cost, it is classified under two heads. You have the direct cost and you have the indirect cost. So direct cost is also termed as a prime cost. And if you remember, in case of your cost sheet, in order to get the prime cost, you are taking into consideration all of the direct expenditures, direct materials, direct labor, and direct expenses. All of these account for prime cost. And then you have the second category under total cost, which are your indirect costs, which are also termed as overheads. So overheads are all of those indirect costs pertaining to material, labor, and expenses. So it will be indirect materials, indirect labor, and your indirect expenses. Okay, so these are your indirect costs or your overheads. So we are only going to be discussing about overheads or your indirect costs under this particular unit. So what is overheads exactly? What do they mean? And how are they going to be subdivided? So as we've already seen, costs pertaining to a cost center or cost unit are divided into two portions, direct and indirect costs. So the indirect portion of the total cost will constitute the overhead cost, which is the aggregate of your or the total of your indirect material cost and then your indirect wages and also indirect expenses. In fact, the CIMA the Chartered Institute of Management Accounts. Okay, the Chartered Institute of Management Accounting or Management Accounts is a body in the UK, like we have the ICAI in India. So the CIMA, it defines indirect costs as expenditure on labor, material, or services which cannot be economically identified with a specific saleable cost per unit. Okay, so they are all of those additional costs incurred which you cannot pinpoint exactly to where they belong. So indirect costs are those which are incurred for the benefit of a number of cost centers or cost units. As we've said earlier, they are those costs which are required for multiple areas. They are those costs which are incurred due to the work done on multiple departments, maybe. Okay, so it is the indirect costs are incurred for the benefit of a large number of cost centers. Now, indirect costs cannot be conveniently identified with a particular cost center or cost unit, but it can be apportioned to or absorbed by cost centers or cost units. Even though we cannot clearly identify where it belongs to, yet with the help of the CAS3, we can identify, we can try to apportion it, and also we can see how these various costs can be absorbed. Okay, and then you have overheads comprise all of those expenditures incurred for or in connection with the general organization. So simply put, overhead costs are made for the benefit of the organization. Okay, they are not for other purposes, but rather they are only for the purpose of the organization. So there has overhead costs, even though they cannot be allocated, even though they are required. There are debates nowadays that ask, should overhead costs be higher than the direct costs, and is it okay to have high overhead costs? Does it show that the company is more efficient? Because they're saying that because there is a lot of overheads, and that means a lot of people are using machines in the firm, right? However, one thing to always remember, overhead costs are also costs. If there is an increase in the cost of the production of goods and services, it would ultimately affect the end product, right? It will ultimately affect the cost of the product, which would affect the end user. So the higher the price of the product, the demand would decrease. So higher overhead costs is not an indication of high efficiency. They should try to reduce these overhead costs as much as possible, just like how they're trying to reduce the direct cost. Okay, so next, let's look at the classification of overhead costs. What are overhead costs? What are the different categories that they are falling into? So when we're talking about overhead costs, we basically have 5 categories. You can divide them function-wise, you can divide them behavior-wise, and then element-wise, control-wise, and also you can divide them based upon the normality. However, we're only going to be learning about 3 of these classifications. We're going to learn about the classification based upon functions, based upon behavior, and based upon the elements. Okay, we're going to learn about the classification of overheads based upon the first 3 categories alone. So cost classification is basically a process of grouping costs according to the common characteristics and establishing a series of special groups. So because of that, we are going to classify our various costs on the basis of the various activities that they have. So firstly, function-wise classification of cost. Okay, the first thing we're going to look at is the function-wise classification of costs. So based upon the classification of costs on the functions, we can have these different areas. You can have manufacturing overheads, administration overheads, selling overheads, distribution overheads, and you can have research and development costs or research and development expenses or overheads. Now, based upon function, it's very simple to classify. So when overheads expenses are classified with reference to the major activity or the major work that is being done of the concern, that will be termed as functional classification of overheads. Okay, so this classification is necessary especially for the segregation or for the division of the cost of each of the principal functional division of the concern. And these are basically the main groups that we can see, these 5 groups, but there could be other groups depending upon the size and the nature of the organization. So firstly, look at the manufacturing overhead. Manufacturing overheads are the overheads which are incurred in case of manufacturing, right? All of the expenses incurred when we are carrying out the manufacturing of a product, isn't it? So it is also known as production overheads or factory overheads or work overheads or works on cost and so on. So in case of production overheads, the main kinds of costs that could be incurred could be due to depreciation of plant and machinery, and then power cost, factory rent, lighting, stationery, and then repair of your plant and machinery, insurance on your plant and machinery, right? All of these will come under manufacturing cost. All of the costs incurred upon manufacturing. So what are the things you need for manufacturing? You'll need machines, right? So for maintenance of your machines, and then also for manufacturing, you will need a building. So for that building, and then electricity is also required. So all of those costs come under manufacturing overheads. Secondly, you have administration overheads. So when we're talking about administration, it basically refers to your management. Okay, so administration overheads refer to those expenses which are incurred for the management of the organization. So it could be the sum of costs of general management, and then the amount paid for the secretaries, and then for accounting and various other services which cannot be directly related to the production. So the main examples of administration overheads could be the office rent. Remember, it's office rent and not the rent of the building where you are producing the goods. Okay, it's the rent of the office. It could be two separate places, or it could be one place together. And then you have the salaries that you're going to be paying to your various administrative staff, like your secretary or accountant. Okay, and then the fees paying to the director, and then the amount paid for electricity in the office, and then bank charges, legal expenses, and then in case of the you will be having furniture in the office, right? So depreciation of that furniture, repairs on the furniture, all of those relate to administration overhead. And then you have selling overheads. Selling overheads can also be termed as marketing overheads. So when we're talking about selling and marketing overhead costs, all those costs that are incurred when you're selling a product, when you're marketing a product. So under this situation, you could have a salesman's salary, and then commission on sales, and then if you have an office for your sales, then the sales office expenses, and then if you're preparing a brochure or if you're preparing a catalog, then the cost of those catalog, printing the catalog, right? All of those will fall under selling and marketing overhead cost. And then the next one, you have distribution overheads. Of course, this is for delivering of your products and services, okay, when you're distributing your products and services. So it is that portion of marketing costs. It is a part of marketing and selling overheads itself. But because it's quite a huge expenditure, that is why it has been given a separate overhead cost, okay? So these will include the amounts incurred in case of renting of a warehouse, and then for the staff who are taking care of the warehouse, the salaries you have to pay, and then for carriage outward, right, for transportation of the goods, and then warehouse lighting, and for packaging of your goods also for transportation, and then for insurance. All of those come under distribution overheads. And next you have research and development costs. So as we've seen in case of any firm also, they keep on wanting to innovate, right? They want to change their products. Today they're producing something, tomorrow they want to produce the same thing but with different aspects. So for that, they need to have an in-depth study, and they have to have research and innovation. So research cost is basically an indirect cost which is incurred in searching for new products or new uses of existing products, and then how to produce the same product with new materials, or maybe use new methods of production. Okay, so under this, you can have mostly in the costs will be mostly through when you're buying raw materials for the purpose of research, and then depreciation of equipment, research payment for research staff, their salaries, and then depreciation of the assets, depreciation of the buildings which are used for research, and maybe even lighting charges also. Okay, so these are the various overheads under the function-wise classification. Now moving on, the next category is behavior-wise classification. In fact, this is one of the few most important classifications of overheads. So under behavior-wise classification, you have fixed overheads, variable overheads, and semi-variable overhead costs. So fixed overheads, from the name itself, the overheads that are fixed. Variable, those that keep changing. In case of semi-variable, they're also termed as semi-fixed because they are half variable and half fixed. So let's look at them a little bit in detail right now. So in case of behavior-wise classification, now under this method of classification, the focus is mainly on the behavior of the cost, and various cost items behave in different ways depending on how the particular materials or how the services are going to be used. So cost behavior is not going to be permanent in nature. What is fixed today may be a variable later. Okay, so under this head, overheads are classified with reference to their tendency to vary with the production or sales volume or the activity level. And as we've seen earlier, the focus is going to be on the behavior of the cost, whether they're going to remain whether they're going to be remaining fixed, whether they're going to change for the different kinds of production. Okay, so based under that, firstly, you have your fixed overhead cost. So fixed overhead costs are those costs which remain constant irrespective of changes of output and sales. And fixed overhead costs are basically not going to change just even though there's a change in the output production or in the change in the sales. Now, fixed overhead costs per unit will decrease as production increases, and they will increase as production decreases. So when it comes to fixed overhead costs, they have an inverse relationship with the production. They will increase when production decreases, and they will decrease when production increases. Okay, these are your fixed overhead costs. So fixed overhead costs, they are also termed as period cost, and remember, they remain constant. Okay, however, even though they remain constant, they are not always fixed. They remain constant only in the short run, and they will vary in the long run. So examples of your fixed overhead costs could be expenses on rent and building. For maybe the rent could be the same for 10 years. After that, they'll want to appreciate the rent, right? And then you have salaries of managers, salaries of your workers. You have to keep increasing the salaries. And then after that, bank charges, amount on payment you're paying on stationery. Today, a pencil is 3 rupees. Tomorrow, it might be 5 rupees, right? In the short run, the prices will remain the same. However, in the future, after some point, the prices or the costs will change. The value will change. So fixed overhead costs will be fixed only for a certain point of time. After that, they will change. And then next, you have variable overheads. So variable overheads have been defined as a cost in which the aggregate tends to change in direct proportion to change in the volume of output or turnover. In case of fixed overhead cost, even though the volume of output and the sales change, there is no change in the overhead cost. But in case of variable cost, it is the exact opposite. They will change with a change in the volume of output or turnover. So these costs will vary in proportion to the volume of output, while unit variable costs remain constant at all levels. So these costs are also referred to as costs which are directly related to production. Okay, whereas in case of fixed overhead costs, they were inversely related to production. The higher the production, the lesser the cost. But in case of variable overheads, they are directly relating to production. So higher production, higher cost. Total variable costs are also directly proportional to the volume of output. So examples, you have your indirect labor, indirect material, then you have power, fuel, spoilage, overtime pay, idle time pay, and so on. All right, and then you have your semi-variable overheads. So semi-variable overheads are also termed as semi-fixed costs. They are the costs which are partly fixed and partly variable. And they have both the features of fixed and variable costs. And these costs, basically, they remain fixed up to a certain volume of output, but they will change once the volume of output changes. So let's say there is a fixed amount of 10 units. So once they cross that 10 units, then they'll change in cost. Okay. So basic example for this could be supervisor's salary, wherein one supervisor may effectively supervise 5 or 6 employees, and that amount is fixed. More than that, then the salary will increase. Okay. And the other basic examples could be for postage and stationery, and then supervision, inspection charges. All of these are included under semi-variable cost. And the final classification that you have that we're going to be talking about is the element-wise classification. Now, under element-wise classification of your cost, you have indirect materials, indirect labor, and indirect expenses. Okay, so basically, all of the costs relating to materials which are not going to be used directly, or labor which are not directly going to be affecting the main laborers, and the expenses which are not direct expenses, all of these are your element-wise classification. So under element-wise classifications, we've seen that they are classified on the basis of the subdivision of the total overheads, okay, or the subdivision of the total overheads. So total overheads are materials, labor, expenses. The total of those your indirect portions. So in case of the element-wise classification, firstly you have indirect materials. So indirect materials are those materials which are consumed in general for a number of output units as a common cost, but which cannot be identified with particular cost units. They are materials which are going to be used for the firm at the time of production, but you're unable to determine where exactly they are, which department exactly they should fall under. Okay, so they can be apportioned to cost centers and they can finally be absorbed by cost units. So main examples of indirect materials could be materials used for repairs and maintenance of machinery, building, and so on, right? Because when you're buying materials for repair, you're not going to buy it only for the repair of machines that are there in the production department or only for the repair of the building that is being used by the advertising department, right? When you buy tools, these are mainly used for the entire firm, right? So additionally, you can have stationery also, cost of stationery purchased for use in the office, and then for the advertising of the posters, right? When you're advertising a product, you're basically advertising the entire firm itself. So the cost is for the entire firm. And then for the printing of pamphlets, okay, all of these are all relating to your indirect materials. And the next element-wise classification is your indirect labor. Now, in case of indirect labor, the wages and salaries which cannot be identified with particular cost centers and cost units are termed as indirect labor. Okay, these are wages and salaries which you cannot pinpoint which department or which area they fall under. So the indirect labor is going to be apportioned to and absorbed by cost centers and cost units, just like in case of indirect materials. Now, generally, the indirect wages are paid to employees who are employed other than for production. So, for example, you have your maintenance workers' wages and then remuneration of your personnel who are handling materials or who are taking care of the internal transportation, and then additionally the leave pay, medical benefits, and then employers' contribution to provident fund, and then managers' salaries, commission to salesmen. All of these are relating to indirect labor. And the third classification under element-wise is your indirect expenses. So indirect expenses are basically the expenses which are incurred commonly for more than one cost center. They are going to be expenses which are incurred for multiple centers. So as a result that because they are going to be used among different centers, we cannot trace exactly which particular cost center or cost unit they belong to. Okay, so the indirect expenses again are generally going to be apportioned and absorbed by cost centers and cost units. So the main examples in case of indirect expenses could be rent. When you're paying rent, you're not going to be paying only for one room, which is going to be used only by one department, right? You're going to be paying rent on the entire asset or the entire building. So you cannot apportion where exactly the rent should fall under. And then insurance amount, and then power and fuel, lighting, heating charges, telephone charges, and so on and so forth. Okay, so these are your element-wise classification. And then other than that, you've also seen that we have a few other classifications. You have the control-wise classification of overheads and also classification based upon normality. So I'll just give you a brief introduction into these remaining two, though you do not need them. So control-wise classification, the costs will be classified into two parts: controllable costs and uncontrollable costs. Okay, so controllable costs are those costs which can be controlled by the managerial decisions, and they are influenced by the decisions made by the managers. That is, you can reduce these costs. Whereas uncontrollable costs are those costs which cannot be controlled, which you cannot reduce even though the managers take action on them. Okay, and then you have classification of overheads based on normality. So according to this, the overheads will be classified under two heads: normal overheads and abnormal overheads. So normal overheads are those which are incurred in achieving expected level of output. So they are basically expenses which are relating to production and they are unavoidable. So these costs basically form a part of production costs, whereas abnormal overhead costs are those which are not expected, which arise out of nowhere. Okay, so like your abnormal idle time and then abnormal wastage, all of these are pertaining to your overheads based upon normality. Okay, so these expenses will all be transferred to your costing, profit and loss account. So this is it with regards to the classification of your overhead costs, okay, under these 5 categories.